Well, this morning, I want to tell you the story and begin with one of my favorite stories. It actually happened on the subway in New York City on January 10th, 1948. There was a Hungarian immigrant named Marcel Sternberger. He was riding his usual train from the city, and he boarded the subway. And so en route, he decided to visit a friend of his in Brooklyn who was sick. And so accordingly, at Ozone Park, he actually changed trains to a subway bound for Brooklyn. And arriving at his friend's house, he stayed there till about mid-afternoon. So he then boarded a Manhattan-bound subway for his Fifth Avenue office. And as he got on that crowded train, he noticed a young man in his 30s who just so happened to be reading a Hungarian newspaper. And I remember the time frame that this is happening in. Marcel actually greeted the young man, who was surprised to meet another Hungarian. And so on the half-hour train ride, Marcel heard this young man's entire story, how he had been put into a German labor battalion in World War II and sent to Ukraine. Later, he was captured by the Russians, and he was actually put to work. And after the war, he covered hundreds of miles on foot only to reach his home in eastern Hungary. And there he found this sad state in his home. There were strangers living in his home instead of his father and mother and brothers and sister and wife. And nobody had actually even heard of his family. This young man's name was Bela Paskin. He later learned that his entire family had been taken to the concentration camp known as Auschwitz by the Nazis. And then he heard these words that haunted him up until that day that he was on that subway. Your whole family is dead. Just days later, he actually set out on foot across the border until he reached Paris, where he'd immigrated to the U.S. just 3 months earlier from the time he was on that subway. All that time, he'd been talking to Marcel. A thought entered Marcel's head that story sounded strangely familiar. He had met a young woman at the home of some friends, and she amazed him with a story about being in eastern Hungary and being taken to Auschwitz. And she watched one after one her relatives die and then being liberated and brought to the U.S. And her story moved Marcel so much that he wrote down her name and her phone number. And he intended to invite her to meet his own family and thus help her actually relieve the terrible emptiness that was in her life. Marcel began to fumble around in his address book as he was sitting with Paskin as the train rocked back and forth. It seemed impossible that there could be any connection meeting this man on the other side of the world after this horrific experience. But he said, hey, it's worth a shot. Marcel asked in a casual voice, was your wife's name Maria? Bela Paskin turned pale and answered, yes. How did you know that? Marcel calmly took Paskin by the hand, exited the train, and headed towards a payphone. Marcel called Maria, who just so happened to be passing by the phone in the hallway of her apartment. She rarely answered it because she didn't know anybody around there and nobody ever called her, but she answered the phone, and Marcel said, Maria, this is Marcel. We met a few months ago, and you told me your story. And can I just ask you, where did you live in eastern Hungary? And she responded to him on the phone. Marcel turned to Bela and he said, Bela, did you and your wife live on such and such street in eastern Hungary? And of course, Paskin by this time is just frantic, and he says, yes. And Marcel answered, and he said, try to be calm. He said, something miraculous is about to happen to you. He said, take this telephone and talk to your wife. One of the reasons I love that story is because it helps us understand the beauty of God's providence. So many impossibilities, so many ironies, so many seemingly random coincidences coming together to form such a beautiful story, right? The fact that he decided to go visit the sick friend in Brooklyn and just so happened to take that train at that moment in time and see the man reading that newspaper. And that he had had that interaction with Maria just a few months earlier. Not to mention the fact that she had been liberated after watching her entire family die, that Bella had made it to that specific area of New York and was on that train, and just all of those seeming coincidences. You see, this same kind of strange providence after providence after providence also describes this book that we're studying today, known as the book of Esther. Esther is a book that some have struggled with for the simple fact that it doesn't have a single mention of God throughout the entire book. Did you know that? There's no mention of God anywhere in the entire book of Esther. In fact, some of the early reformers said that it should be tossed out of the Old Testament canon because it doesn't have any mention of God. But like the story of Marcel Sternberger meeting Bella Paskin on a Brooklyn subway, while God is not mentioned at all, his fingerprints are all over it. And so let's dive into the book of Esther this morning and consider this great story. And so the story of Esther, we're just going to kind of walk through it because it's one of those things, kind of like the story of Bella Paskin. You just can't help but to be amazed at how this story goes. A few weeks ago, as we studied the book of Daniel, and last week as we studied the book of Ezekiel, we saw that these exiled generations of Israel encountering the Lord and walking with Him in faithfulness and in courage as they lived life that was unsafe in exile, a life that was faithful even when the pressure was on, even when they were surrounded by their enemies. Remember, God's desire from very early on in Genesis was that His glory would be revealed among the nations through Israel, going all the way back to Genesis 12, Genesis 15, and Abraham. And that's exactly what happens as Israel is dispersed among the nations, as southern Israel's conquered and Babylon takes the exiles and takes them to this place. And Daniel experienced it, that just because God's favor and presence is resting upon His people doesn't mean that the enemies of God, though, are just going to stand down. This just provides more opportunities, though, for God's glory to be revealed. And this is what we're going to see in the story of Esther. And so in Esther chapter 1, we come face to face with a king named King Ahasuerus. Now, it's not like he had an idea and he was like, aha, it's not like that. But this is it's actually a king that you're very familiar with. This is his Hebrew name. Now, his Persian name is King Xerxes. King Xerxes. Now, you would be familiar with that. And he is most likely having his 6-month war summit where he's planning the attack on Greece, where he would eventually go and face Leonidas and his army of 300 at the Hot Gates, the gates of Thermopylae. You probably heard about that story, right? And so after the war summit, the king throws a drunken rave for all of his friends and his leaders and the officials. And so in verse 11 of chapter 1, Ahasuerus or Xerxes' queen Vashti, is encouraged to and I'll be gentle here, to come and make appearance with her royal crown. Some commentators think that she was encouraged to come and dance for the men wearing only her crown, if you get my drift. And others think that she was pregnant and just wasn't having it, right, with her son, who would be King Artaxerxes, who was Nehemiah's boss, as we'll see him interact with Nehemiah in a few weeks. And she was just like, hey, bro, I'm pregnant. My feet are swollen, not having it, right? I'm not coming over there. One way or another, she did the thing that you're not supposed to do, disobey the king. And so the admonition of the leaders who didn't really want to see their own women's liberation movement in their day, the king divorces Vashti and deposes her as the queen. So that's Esther chapter 1. And so Xerxes, for the next several years, he enacts the plans he made in chapter 1, and he invades Greece, and he is defeated. So he comes home frustrated and in need of some distraction. And he realizes that he has not replaced Vashti. So he holds a nationwide beauty pageant, right, to try and, I guess, assuage his hurt feelings. And so in verse 5, we are introduced to a man named Mordecai who has an orphan cousin that was about 15 years younger than he was. And he had taken her in when her parents died, probably out of about 25 million women in Persia at this time. Esther was chosen to join the harem of the king and be the next potential queen. And being a beautiful young woman, the king was smitten with her, and she becomes the queen. Now, around this same time, Mordecai hears about a plot to kill Xerxes, which was probably more common than we would realize. And so Mordecai makes it known to Esther, and Esther and Mordecai plan to stop it. And the Persians, they were great historians. They recorded everything, which is why we know so much about them. And so Mordecai's service to stop the assassination plot is recorded in the Persian records, and that's chapter 2. So we get to Esther chapter 3, and we're introduced to a guy named Haman the Agagite. Haman the Agagite. The king appoints Haman the Agagite as his prime minister. Now, the Agagites were part of the ancient Canaanite tribes and that had mostly been destroyed under King Saul. Haman and Mordecai both knew their family lineage and the rivalries that existed, kind of like the Hatfield McCoys, right? They knew that backstory, and neither one of them liked each other. And so specifically one day, Haman passes by, and basically everybody else is bowing down to Haman because Haman's the prime minister. He's this bigwig in the government, and Mordecai's like, I ain't bowing down to you, right? That good old rebellious nature of Mordecai. And so Haman goes to the king, and he lies to him, telling him that none of the Jews in the kingdom follow the king's laws, and they all need to be killed. And at this point, no one knows that Esther is a Jew, because she hid that from the king at Mordecai's insistence. That's chapter 3. So you go to Esther chapter 4, and this is the most famous story in the chapter where Mordecai and Esther talk about the situation and what they can do about it. So if you're not at chapter 4, go to chapter 4. Mordecai obviously goes to Esther and wants her to intervene. I mean, she's the queen, right? But there's this strange law that says that anyone who comes into the presence of the king uninvited should be killed unless the king offers to hear them by extending his scepter to them. And so Esther's understandably fearful, right? There's this possibility that she could be killed. So if you don't have it marked in your Bible, it's one of those verses that everybody once they read it, they're like, oh, that seems like a really significant verse in the Bible. So Esther chapter 4, verse 14. He says, for if you keep silent at this time, Mordecai says to Esther, relief and deliverance will rise for the Jews from another place, but you and your father's house will perish. And who knows whether or not you've come to the kingdom for such a time as this. Now I want you to think about what you've heard this morning, what you've sung this morning. Sung. I'll talk to one of you English teachers about that later. What you've been singing this morning, what you've been meditating on this morning, what you've read this morning. And so as we think about that together, and you've heard Tucker's testimony, now fix your mind on Esther 4:14 and what Mordecai is saying. Esther's apprehensive because, hey, if the king doesn't invite me into his presence, I could be killed. And Mordecai responds to Esther's apprehension saying, don't buy into the lie that you're safe, but recognize that you've been put where you are for a reason. Now this, I don't know if he had the motivational prowess of a Rocky Balboa or Captain America or something like that, right? But obviously it works because in verse 16, look at what she says. She says, "Go gather all the Jews to be found in Susa and hold a fast on my behalf. Do not eat or drink for 3 days, night or day. I and my young women will also fast as you do. Then I will go to the king, though it is against the law, and if I perish, I perish." So just obviously she's like, let's go. Let's do this. You love that, right? So Esther responds with immense courage. If I die, I die. And so that's chapter 4. Chapter 5, Esther prepares, she enters the presence of the banquet. She enters the presence of the king without issue, right? So it's like one of those things, once again, our perceived fears are really not the issue. It's just kind of one of those things that oftentimes we throw up things, throw up obstacles that are not the real issue. It kind of oftentimes, if we're honest, our human nature is just our excuse. And so that's not the real issue we should be concerned about, which Mordecai was kind of helpful to let her see through. And so Esther enters the presence of the king and has no issue, invites him and Haman to a banquet. She's like, hey, I'm going to throw a party in your honor. And at the banquet, Esther, she kind of has another moment of crisis. She doesn't exactly feel the timing is right. You could chalk this up to women's intuition, which I've learned in my house full of women. Trust it, okay? It's just most of the time, right? So she asked the king to come back to another banquet the next night. So feeling excited about his personal favor with the king and queen, he's like, hey, I am in high cotton, like would be the phrase he would say if he was from the South. You know, I'm with the most important people in society. Prideful Haman once again passes this wretched man Mordecai, the only person who will not acknowledge Haman's greatness. And now we see why Esther's intuition was telling her, hey, just let some things play out. And so Haman sees Mordecai once again. Everybody's like, oh, there's Haman. Hey, what a guy, what a guy. Mordecai's like, yeah, what a guy, you know. And Haman's like, you know, and he's like enraged. And so Haman's like, I guess he just had this kind of clout. He gets on his Babylon phone, and he's like, I want a 75-foot gallows built, and by tomorrow, Mordecai's going to die, you know. And so he builds this execution device for Mordecai. He's going down, and he's going to be killed the next day. Because don't you know who I am? I'm Haman. I'm dining with the king and the queen. I mean, the queen is serving me, and the king's my bro, right? I'm basically Xerxes. You know, we're one. You know, I mean, that's what he's thinking. And so then you get to Esther 6 and 7. So that night, once again, Esther's intuition is just playing out in a really cool way. That night, the author of the book of Esther, we don't know if it's Mordecai or whoever, but several things happen that, once again, it's very much like the story of Bella Paskin and Marcel Sternberger and all these little things happening. Haman is plotting Mordecai's death. He's watching the gallows being built, and he's like, little higher, little higher, little higher. Yeah, that's what I'm talking about. You know, put gators at the bottom, you know, whatever. It's just making it painful. While at the same time, he's also, got all his posse around him, and they're like, oh, Haman, you're so awesome, right? You're so awesome. He's reveling in his exalted position with the king. At the same time, the queen is beating herself up at the question, why couldn't I just make my request? Why did I ask him to come to another banquet? And then at the same time, the king, maybe he ate something that didn't agree with him. He's got an indigestion. One reason or another, he can't sleep. And so the king asks for one of his guards to read him a bedtime story. That's more or less what happened, right? He's hoping that the monotony of the daily records will, of course, put him to sleep quickly. So out of the hundreds and hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of days that could have been chosen, the guard gets the book that has the event written in it where Mordecai had saved the life of the king. And the king's counting sheep, drifting in and out maybe, but he's cognizant enough for that story to be read, and he's like, hey, wait a second. I don't think we ever threw Mordecai a party thanking him for saving my life. I mean, what a guy, right? We should have thanked him for that. And so the next morning, Haman comes in with a plot to kill Mordecai, and before he can mention it, the king asks, hey, what should be done to the man I want to honor? And so thinking the king is talking about himself, Haman says that the man who the king wants to honor, of course, king, I mean, if it were me, right, he'd put me on the best horse and then have one of your most trusted officials going before the person being honored and shouting about how much the king loves this guy. That's what I would do. I mean, if it were me. And the king's like, you know what? You're right. Now, Haman is shocked and sickened when he realizes that the king isn't talking about, I guess I was a slide behind. Sorry about that, y'all. The king is shocked and sickened when he realizes that he's not talking about honoring Haman. He's actually talking about honoring Mordecai, and that official that's going to go forth shouting the praises of the one the king is honoring. Oh yeah, Haman, that's you, right? So humbled Haman goes and completes the king's request because he's like, I mean, I gotta do it. But the day is about to get worse. When it rains, it pours, poor guy, Haman. Because that night, Esther, once again, Haman is at, this event that he's so happy that he's like, maybe things are going to start turning up. Esther, she's like, okay, the time's right. Maybe Mordecai was like, you will never believe what happened, right? Esther gets word that Mordecai is being trotted around on the horse. Haman's having to look at this guy. The king loves this guy, and of course Esther's like, you've got to be kidding me. That's awesome. I wish I had a picture of it. She didn't know what a picture, she didn't know what that was. But, and so Esther's like, that's okay. Yeah, definitely timing's right. So she goes and says, hey, chapter 7, verse 4, King, let my life be granted to me. And the king's like, who would be trying to take the queen's life? I'm Xerxes. I'll kill anybody, right? I mean, that's what he's thinking. And so you can just imagine the humor of Esther's eyes. I tried to find the funniest picture. Here Esther's like, that's the guy. But I just imagine Esther kind of let my life be granted. And the king's like, who's trying to kill you? And Esther's like, it's kind of side eye. But I do love Haman's face. And he's like, me, right? Yeah. Bad day just got worse, right? And so the king's enraged, right? And I love the story. The story just keeps getting funnier. So the king's just fiery mad, right? And so he gets up and leaves, and Haman realizes that he has just stirred up a hornet's nest. And he's like, I've got to plead with Queen Esther to have mercy. So as the king leaves, Haman gets up to try to plead for his life. And I guess he'd gotten the tailor to make the robe extra long so he'd be extra regal. And he trips and he's like, oops, I fell on top of the queen. And that's right when, this is really what happens. I'm not making this up. That's right when the king walks in. And so Xerxes is like, oh, this is how it's going to go down, right? And so the king literally, I'm not making this up, y'all. Y'all can go read it for yourself. The king's like, give me the nearest gallows. He does. Give me the nearest gallows. And somebody's like, oh, actually there's one right there in Haman's front yard. And the king's like, really? Let's go. And so they all go. And Haman gets hanged on those same gallows, and the Jews are saved, right? That's the way that the story plays out. And it's this incredible story of God's favor being poured out upon his people in a place where God should not be known, where God is not being praised, where they've got their own pantheon of gods who apparently rule that land. And all those Jews who are the minority in that place should be running around in fear, even though one of them has been exalted to the place of queen. Your God is powerless here. The story of Esther shows that God is the God of the gallows. He's the God of providence in all the little places that you think God is absent. God is never absent, church. God has been at work in your life whether you've recognized it or not. So think about it. Queen Vashti's refusal, Esther's beauty and favor, Mordecai's timely act to save the king, Esther's curious request for a second banquet, the king's insomnia, the exact daily record chosen to be read, Haman's arrogance, the gallows already being built. Coincidence or God's quiet orchestration? We saw it last week in Ezekiel. It's better to pursue purpose than safety. The story of Esther confirms it. God's sovereignty doesn't cancel our obedience. It actually sets the stage for it. I'm going to say that again because I think it's extremely important as we wrestle both with theology and practical living. God's sovereignty doesn't cancel the necessity of our obedience. It actually sets the stage for it. Like Joseph, Daniel, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, God truly has given us home field advantage. He's rigged the system, so to speak, not for ease and comfort, but so that his people rise and testify to his greatness among the nations. That is God's purpose, so you can be confident about it. So here's the truth. You can't hold on to your life, so risk it for the kingdom. You can't take your money with you, so spend it for the kingdom. You can't somehow hoard your gifts and skills and abilities to be used in some kind of way for some kind of magnitude in your job at some great point in the future. So leverage it for the kingdom. You see, when Esther faced her crisis of faith, Mordecai didn't sugarcoat what was at stake. If you keep silent, at this time, relief and deliverance will rise up from another place. But who knows whether you've come to the kingdom for such a time as this? Death was possible, sure. But there's something more certain. You say, what's more certain than death? Well, Job actually echoed that years and years, and for us, Sundays and Sundays and Sundays earlier. In Job chapter 42, verse 2, I know that you can do all things, God, and that no purpose of yours can be thwarted. So what's more certain than death? God and his purposes will be accomplished. So what do? Do we live our lives just trying to save our lives? No, we live our lives for what's most important. We live and move and breathe for God's glory. You and I live our lives in this Chronos time. You remember us talking about Chronos time and Kairos time? Chronos time is chronology. It's the sequential moments of time that we're bound to live in. We're locked to live in seconds and minutes and hours and days and weeks and months and years. And let's just be honest, it feels small, it feels routine, it feels unremarkable. God has locked us into Chronos time as a test. Will we live out his lordship in the thousands of mundane moments in our lives? We all long to be part of something significant. We all long to be part of the Kairos moments in time, where something incredible happens, where it says that something happens in the fullness of time, where all of a sudden, like the story we've read in Esther, the Bella Paskin and Marcel Sternberger, where it's just like you read that and you're like, no way, right? It's something decisive, a divine appointment, right? Where heaven touches earth and eternity pivots. You're like, wow. You think, how does that happen? I'll tell you how it happens. I'll tell you the people who recognize when that happens. It's the people who recognize that those Chronos moments, the seconds and the minutes and the days and weeks and months, they may feel mundane, but they're actually that test. It's an opportunity to take captive those moments for the glory of God. 1 Corinthians 10:31, so whether you eat or drink, I mean, what's more mundane than eating or drinking, right? Or whatever you do all for the glory of God. And as we align ourselves with his heart and his priorities, and we say, God, I care about what you care about enough to take captive my mundane moments, then he says, okay, then I'm going to put you in places where it may not be some cataclysmic, world-changing event, but it may be a life-changing event for that person, for that individual. So how do you prepare for a Kairos moment? You take captive every Chronos moment. You live the small days with eternal focus so that you're ready when that big moment comes. Esther didn't wake up knowing that she would be used to save her people, but she'd been formed in silence, in waiting and in prayer, and she had an army of people praying and fasting for her, and she was ready. We've said it over the last several weeks, agape is a place of preparation. If you're a visitor with us this morning, hey, we're glad you're here, but this is a family meeting. Not that you're unwelcome. We want to invite you to be a part of the family. But if you're a regular attender of agape, it's time to put a ring on it and jump in, because you know what we're about, right? Let's go. Let's go. Let's be about taking the Chronos moments captive and pressing forward towards the Kairos moments together, because, like Tucker said, he's worth it. Jesus is worth it. And what he's doing here, as you take advantage of the Chronos moments in all of our lives, as we take advantage of those moments, God is moving in ways through us and around us in our community that if you will align yourself with what he's doing, if you surrender to what he's doing in your life, if you surrender to the calling that he has on your life, that he will put you in the path of somebody who's asking the questions, who's longing for the meaning and the significance and the purpose that only the gospel can bring. And you say, oh, so Ryan, what does that mean? That means that when they're asking those questions that I call you, right, and you show up. No. Because God didn't say, I want to use Ryan in all those instances. He put you there because he wants to use you. And God put me on this platform because that's where he puts the cheerleaders. right? I'm like the mic man at the game, right? I'm like leading the cheer for you because you're on the field. And God's using you. But it's like Tucker said, some are trying to walk out of the stadium. Some Christians put themselves on the sideline, or they're trying to sneak into the injury tent, right? It's all out of the path of discipleship. And so my encouragement to you is, agape is a place of preparation. So where is God calling you to get prepared? Where is God calling you to jump in? As you walk out these doors, you're challenged. Be a disciple, be a difference maker. Neither one of those are connected from life. Be a disciple in your life. And as you walk as a disciple, then learn how to make disciples so that you can help other people be a disciple in their life. Be a difference maker in the life of somebody else. Some of those tasks are mundane, but remember, where does the Lord have us to prepare us? In those chronos, mundane seeming moments, but none of those moments are mundane if Jesus is Lord. So where is God calling you to get prepared? I believe that for what God has called us to, there is no empty spots. There's no wasted spaces. Every one of you has a purpose. And like I said, I'm your cheerleader, right? So let's start that conversation. Let's see what God's doing, because God's doing a lot. And for some of you, it might look like Tucker's Path, where we cheer you on as you get out of here, right? For some of you, it's like, hey, we're going to train you here, and then you might be gone sporadically, like the walkers. For others, it's like, hey, we're going to train you, and you're going to go to work right here. But one way or another, right, the preparation happens. The discipleship, the following Jesus, that's the place to start. These small acts of obedience and response. When we come to this time of invitation, this is what you ask. God, you're doing something. I sense your leadership. And so God, help me to understand. Help me to have clarity. I surrender right now. Would you make that your prayer this morning? As we come to this time of invitation, I sense the Spirit of God moving in this place. And I pray that you do as well. For some of you in here, it may be that you need to trust Christ as Savior and treasure. For others, it may be a call to ministry. It may be a call to missions. It may be a call to discipleship. One way or another, if God is calling in this place, then now's the time to respond. And so I'm going to pray. And then as I pray, the praise team's going to come up. And we enter into this time of invitation. We sing a song. People come down. People pray. People come talk to me. There's all kinds of things that are happening. But it is that time for you to respond to God. So no matter what that response looks like, He's only Lord if you say yes to Him. Not saying yes to me, not saying yes to any other human person in this room, first and foremost. Christianity is about a dynamic relationship with Him. A disciple is one who follows Him. And so if you don't know what that looks like, you don't have that relationship with Him, start there. Let's pray.